visioning process that we went through here in the Fox Cities was a huge impetus for taking a look at how we are connecting each other in the community. You know, and Beth and Kimberly and others can give some more details about, you know, that process. But, you know, one of the key things that came out of one of the 4 pillars, I guess I would say, of the vision that our community created over the last year for where we want to take the Fox Cities is you know, to be a place that everybody who lives here feels like they belong. And so we certainly see this neighborhood work being a critical piece of that. From working from a health system, I would say, you know, the other way, you know, way that I tend to think about this also is thinking about, you know, coming out of this COVID situation and what does recovery look like for our communities. And, you know, through COVID, I think it became very clear that many of the systems that have existed to help us as a community fall short and can't do it all. You know, whether you're thinking about education and, you know, I mean, we've relied so heavily on education to do so much for us, and maybe abdicated some of our personal responsibility or our neighborhood or community responsibility on that front. And so, you know, education system has struggled, you know, like a healthcare system has struggled, you know, our law enforcement systems have struggled through this, and with dealing with some of the race situations, movement also that's come out of this work and out of this period, I should say. And so all of that is intertwined, but we recognize that this coming together is foundational for everything that we want to achieve in the vision we've created for the Fox Cities. And, you know, just for me specifically, you know, creating the health of a population that we want to create. And so it prompted some more in-depth conversations, spinning off of the assets that we already have, starting with the neighbor partners work that's already existing, and others. I mean, that's not the only work that's happening in that space in this area. But you know, our hope is that can we reinforce it to create a stronger foundation across the area here. We want to start in the Fox Cities, eventually maybe connect, you know, Green Bay, Oshkosh, you know, the region into that in some fashion, but want to start in the Fox Cities to really, you know, get it right here. So that's, I would just offer that as a starting point and let others add on. And I know these people are not shy.
Sorry, this
Beth
is
or Kimberly, or
sure.
Yeah.
Tammy, were you going to speak? Kimberly?
Sure, I can jump in. I'm trying to drive at the same time, so I apologize if I'm not as quick to unmute as others. Yeah, I would tag on, you know, from the philanthropic perspective. You know, we're interested in neighborhood related work for all the same reasons that Paula had mentioned, but also just knowing that philanthropy also cannot meet all of the needs, especially coming out of COVID. And, you know, there will have to be innovative, creative ways for people to come together to support one another, and to, you know, help look at it through this lens of belonging and connection and what that means long term.
I'm just really quickly reminded of the idea that you build the relationships before you need them. So it's kind of, as once again, wish we had done more of this earlier, but yes.
Yeah, I just think as we do this work related to Imagine Fox Cities, the belonging work, I think when you think about all the spheres that we could, influence, I think probably the neighborhood, when you talk about belonging, when people, think about um, belonging, I think having the unit of neighborhood is a very effective place to, put our efforts. I think, people probably spend more time at work, but when we think about, who we are, where we're from, that kind of thing, the neighborhood and your experience in the neighborhood, I think plays a huge part. And, most of us have something that we consider a neighborhood. And so I think, again, using that as sort of a unit or a level at which we could reach everyone makes sense to me. But I think one thing that is problematic, I guess there are a couple of things that are problematic, and one of those is how segregated our neighborhoods are. And, in this country, we had a big move towards integration after the, Civil Rights Act and all of that in the 60s. But in the 80s, all of our, institutions resegregated, whether it's schools, neighborhoods, that kind of thing. So now we're more segregated probably than we were, in the 70s, definitely, possibly in the 60s. But so I'm concerned about the lack of diversity and inclusion if we simply stay at the level of neighborhood. I think it's a great place to start and a great place to sort of begin to, talk about social cohesion and inclusion. But I think if we really want to create a sense of belonging in the Fox cities, we're going to have to go beyond the neighborhood, maybe use the neighborhood units as a way to get people to be more inclusive and help people have a sense of belonging beyond the neighborhood. So I'm excited about it, and I think it's essential to do neighborhood work, but I think it's definitely not, sufficient. So I think, I'm interested to see where this goes and how we can use this to help, foster belonging and inclusion.
I think that's a very good point, that one of the truths about a neighborhood or any small scale organization is it is likely to be more homogeneous than you'd like. And so the question is, how do we get beyond bonding into bridging? I suppose using Bob Putnam's categories. And that's a difficult kind of process, but I think it can be achieved, particularly if we begin to think, how do you get small scale groups of people engaged with people who are beyond their immediate scope? And I think there are ways demonstrably that you can do that. But it's always a good friend of ours in the ABCD Institute was Judith Snow, who always said the real issue is, how can we have communities with a welcome at the edge? What makes that happen? And I think that's a critical part of the planning ahead and the mission statement.
Yeah, I agree. We see in Green Bay a host of neighborhood associations that are all very homogeneous, and they wonder about some of the folks that aren't present at that table when they're meeting in their associations, and they're trying to figure out how to engage with maybe their Latino neighbors or other folks that are not engaged with them, and they fall into a trap sometimes of believing that, you know, that those neighbors are not actually engaged in the community, where they might be engaged in many communities, but just not necessarily the same geography as the association. They might be engaged in a faith-based organization or through other, you know, through other community and social enterprises, that they're very much belonging to a community and feeling connected to their neighbors. They just might draw that neighborhood line a little differently, and that's, I think, a constant source for us of education and work, is helping people understand that, you know, it's not a matter of getting, quote, those people to come to my meeting. It's about understanding, you know, your neighbor and engaging with them in whatever way you can. And you know, we always remind them food helps, you know, parks help, you know, get outside, be together, talk about things that are affecting your physical neighborhood maybe, and that might get folks engaged. Yeah, for our work, you know, in Green Bay, and I'm really intrigued by what Julie's doing throughout the region, including in Southern Brown County, is just this notion of you know, the neighborhood connectors and the people working to kind of move things along and support the organizing and community building work. We see a lot of folks in our neighborhoods where we were doing some survey work around satisfaction with the neighborhood and other, you know, things that was eventually going to be used to justify funding through some aggregation of data over periods of time and show that our work was making an impact. And we saw, and I forgive me if I've told some of this story before, but we saw a lot of folks loving the neighborhood and some folks not loving the neighborhood. And we realized that the difference was the folks who weren't connected to anybody didn't like the neighborhood. They didn't feel safe. They didn't feel, you know, a sense of belonging. And because there was no other correlations, we couldn't find correlations in age and race, ethnicity, tenure in the neighborhood, or anything like that. So that really opened our eyes to the need to address that, whether it's from a practical level. We do a lot of housing renovation work. We do a lot of other homeownership promotion work and things like that. And those folks who weren't feeling connected were sometimes a barrier to some of the things we were trying to do to change things for the better, you know, as a resident-led organization. And rather than viewing them as an obstacle, well, now we just recognize them as people who just aren't connected, and we need to foster those connections somehow. Because there's, you know, it could be their best friend is just living around the block, they just don't know it yet. Yeah. And so that's when I look at that, I was working with Julie through another group and realized that might be an engine to help advance some of this stuff.
You know, I think the idea of bringing people together in associations of any kind, associations within a neighborhood and associations across neighborhoods, and figuring out how to just connect as many people as possible to whatever, and ideally some things that are going to be doing that bridging, both inside the neighborhood and maybe across the community, is
Julie,
kind of where we need to go.
Sorry, Julie.
Nope.
This is Tom. I just, listening to this, particularly your comments and all, I've just been thinking a lot of people right now who are feeling very isolated, particularly with the COVID situation. I mean, there's a window right now where people are desperately feeling isolated in so many environments and feeling vulnerable because they don't have networks, they don't have connections, they don't have relationships, and things have become so individualistic that I oftentimes start workshops by having them play tic-tac-toe and putting themselves in the center, and then putting down the names of the people who live around you. If anybody can put 2 or 3 across, then they get to say bingo. And I rarely get people who can do it. which is pretty scary for a society. So I just want to affirm the importance of what you're doing, and all relationships are one-on-one. I mean, it all begins with that creation of helping people appreciate one-on-one relationships. That one of the things I always say is change happens at the speed of relationships. And you can get things to happen out of from the institution out, but you don't get anything to happen from the bottom up, inside out, from the heart out, without it really being relational. And that's why I just want to do anything I can to help support you in getting that to happen in the Fox Valley.
One of the other things that I think goes with belonging is small scale. That the sense that I belong grows out of the capacity to relate, as Tom is talking about, to a group of people. But I think relate more than saying hello to a neighbor or even having a block party. It means that you have a commitment to each other. And I think those commitments tend to grow out of doing something together. The great threshold, I think, to reaching belonging is not that people know somebody's name necessarily, but that they have done something together. And out of that, knowledge of each other and seeing the mutual commitment grows the sense that we belong. So how do we get ourselves organized in a way that that experience of doing things together that is the fountainhead of belonging can take place? And one of the things that I think we've been particularly interested in as well is starting with the premise that if we're thinking at the small scale, that we're not thinking how can we get them to do what we would like them to do, right? Which seems to me is how many institutions deal with people in a local place. They see them as instruments for some larger purpose. And so I think the connectedness that works starts always with listening and understanding what people, number one, have, and what, number two, they want to do. And so that's a threshold for many of us who come from institutions, is to say, how can we be supportive of the kind of connectedness that grows from what people want to do, what gifts they have, and how they can make those connections. With just a few, I think, framing principles that we have tended to work on.
Yeah, I just add one very quick thing, and that is, I think what John's pointing to is the power of story. And those neighborhoods have to create their own stories of things they've done together. You know, growing up in a farm community, Section 19 of Jacksonport Township, Door County, we had to do things together when I was a kid. We don't have to do that anymore. All the farmers are now totally independent with all their own stuff. And, you know, they're losing connection. And we're seeing it in urban areas too. People do not have the common stories anymore. And so the kind of work we're talking about is really about how to bring people together in relationship to create their own narratives, their own stories for their place.
Yeah.
So a question I would have for the two of you is, you know, so as we mentioned earlier, we have several neighborhood associations happening across the Fox cities already. Julie's been very engaged in a lot of that work. But if we want to take this to another larger scale, so that you know, we know that we need, you know, maybe, well, I guess I would ask you the question. What would be your approach if we want to be the community in the U.S. that has where, you know, actually part of the national vision for some of the work coming out of the CDC of, you know, recovery from COVID is, you know, the vision that all people are thriving, all people and places are thriving. So if we want to create that sense of belonging and inclusion and connectedness across our whole community, whole Fox Cities area to begin with, how would you suggest we approach that to take what we already have to the next level?
And I wanted to make a point. I'm sorry, Paula, and if you all can remember Paula's very important question. I think as I was listening to, is it Jim and Tom talk, one of the things that came to mind for me is this idea of mattering. So belonging really relates to the extent to which you matter. And we've, you know, heard that used a lot in terms of Black Lives Matter, but it's also in the research. So when you talk about what people want, what we need, having them determine that, having it be individual based on assets and strengths, it's really having people feel like they matter. What they can bring matter, what they need matters. And so again, that really ties into what you all were talking about. And when I said there were a couple of problems with, you know, this approach, one of them was the lack of diversity, and the other was sort of our individualistic nature now that we have the community, and the fact that we don't often know our neighbors. You know, we've had a couple of parties, and we're one of the newer people in our neighborhood, and some folks said, "Oh, I've lived next to this person for 15 years and never talked to them." And so, yeah, so,
Yep.
so I agree. And particularly, I think this idea of mattering, and how do we help people feel like they matter?
I like that point. I think that you look back in time, you would see that a lot of people thought that their neighborhood mattered because, especially, there was a sort of a joint agreement about how they were responsible for the children in the neighborhood. I'm a pretty old guy, and I can remember in a lower income neighborhood in Cincinnati where I was raised that I had the sense around me that the people who were there, living there, were a part of me. I was a part of them. They were watching over me. They were doing things that me be better than I had been. And so it seems to me that what makes a difference is that people begin to say, we have a function. We have a place in Green Bay. We have a place in this city. And our place is that we have a role, functions that we can perform. We have something to do about our health and about our safety and about growing food and about improving the environment. So the function is have people see themselves in a new light, that they are not the recipients and consumers, but they are people with functions that make a difference and make things meaningful for them. And I think the other thing that people have is not only the potential to have functions, but also to manifest their gifts and their skills and their abilities. That wherever you see a block or a neighborhood where people understand that everybody here has something to contribute. They want to contribute it. It's what they value. And as they contribute it, they're fulfilling a basic function that isn't going to be done any other place. We're responsible for the kids here. We're responsible for our health. We have a big piece of that work. So it's, I think, finding ways that precipitate people's contributing and beginning to see that they have the potential and the power to take on important things that make their lives meaningful. And I think there are places where you can see that experiment, including what I've learned from Julie, examples where you are as well. Tom, you add to that?
No, I want to hear a few of the people, John, that haven't chimed in because I just think this is a really good conversation for us to hear how you guys are thinking about this. The only thing I'd add, which is kind of a summation piece to what John and others have said, which maybe most of you are familiar with, but we always start by what can you do yourself? Right here in this neighborhood, what can you do yourself? What can you do with a little help? What do you need other people to do that you can't do yourself? But you always start with what we can do right here. What matters? I mean, I really like that, Kimberly, the whole idea that, you know, the mattering. I gotta matter. It's gotta come out of my gifts, my talents that I want to give to my neighborhood in whatever way. And most people never have no clue that living next door and the house behind them, whatever it is, could be just a wealth of talent and gifts that are ready to be given, but no one's asked. So we just feel you got to start bottom up, heart out. And so that's, you know, what can you do yourself? What can you do with a little help? What do you need somebody else to do? When I was with the city, I always said, you know, first you buy the snow shovel. Secondarily, a group of you buy a snow blower together in your neighborhood. Thirdly, you pay taxes and you get a snow plow. But you don't, you know, you start with the shovel and shoveling for your neighbor. With me on the idea? That's a big shift today from what's going on with institutions in a lot of ways. I mean, I think this would be a real education for a lot of institutions to allow room, space for the growth of those neighborhoods and allow them to develop from the bottom up. Because even when we don't think about it, subconsciously, we oftentimes suppress the design of neighborhoods by outside forces stepping in rather than allowing people to do what they can do themselves.
Tom, I can't resist adding to your thought on people contributing. One of the things we know from working with neighborhoods who have a lot of people who go door to door and get to know about their neighbors is that anybody on any block has something about themselves that they value. We would call them gifts, skills, passions, talents, or knowledge. But they have that, and they are, if you can imagine this, waiting to contribute it. And you can ask them, what do you value most about yourself? What can you do? What do you know? And they'll tell you. And then if you ask them, would you be willing to share that with other people on the block? Almost always people will say yes. So if you rethink what a block is, it's a group of people sitting there waiting for the process of connection that will allow them to give of themselves the thing that they value most about themselves. So it's one of the most hopeful and, in a funny way, easy things that we can do to begin to get people connected to act.
And John, I saw you speak at Neighborhoods USA a few years back in Minneapolis, and talked about that process of gathering that information about, you know, what people, skills and talents and abilities they have and what they're willing to share and do something with. And but and it's so important to do that. The thing I tell some of our neighbors as they're thinking about, you know, inventorying the skills of their neighbors and their neighborhood and things like that, or the interests they've got, is reminding them too. It's like, just knowing that isn't the isn't the best part of the whole process. It's actually the standing on the porch, getting to know them. That's really the best part of that whole process, is you've made that one-on-one connection with that person. And yeah, if they get to share their gifts, that's wonderful. But it's great that you know somebody new, right? You might both share a passion for, you know, something that strikes up a friendship between you, and that's the most valuable thing in the long run, you know. So yeah, we do some asset mapping training and around an ABCD approach with our neighborhoods, and that was the sort of thing I think that both John, you and Tom were talking about, is that started from a group of neighbors going away to some training that NeighborWorks America was offering. And then they came back all jazzed up, and we just said, okay, what do you want to do? And then they said, well, we want to do this same thing we just went to wherever it was at. We want to do a mini version of that locally. And so then there were workshops on asset mapping, you know, running a meeting, you know, getting folks to step up, and just kind of some fundamental organizing skills and other things that were going on. And then everybody just unleashed that in their own projects and their own ideas. So I think that was the best, is like when we can create the environment for the magic to happen and then get out of the way, is pretty exciting.
Great.
I don't want Paula's question to get lost either, because I think this is a question that we've been thinking about a lot, and I really love that we're talking so deep in, but Paula was asking this question about scale. You know, is this a kind of activity that can be taken to scale, and how? Is that, Paula, is that fair? I was trying to summarize quickly. How many people are in our region? Quarter of 250,000, like that. Okay, yeah.
So that's a question for Tom and John.
Which is the scale question?
Yeah, right. The question I asked earlier. So
Yep.
if even putting out, you know, if we want to create this fabric of connection and belonging that spans our you know, entire community of the Fox Cities. So we build off of the existing great neighborhood work that's already here, but we know we got so much more potential. What advice do you have for going to scale, and like do we potentially target versus the entire Fox Cities, or what advice would you have?
You want to take that on?
I can. I don't pretend to have the right answer, because every community's different. So the culture of the Fox Valley has to be, you know, we have to think about that, or Green Bay, or Oshkosh. But you may not like my answer, but I think you cannot go to scale in terms of design until you start at the neighborhood scale of building the relationships at the local level. You can do training, you can do visioning, you can do a lot of things that give people a sense of the promised land, of what's possible together. You could do that across the whole area where you identify leaders and bring them together and energize them. And they go back to Wapaka and they go back to, you know, Oshkosh or wherever, and they begin trying to build it. But the scale has to come from the bottom up. It'll only become strong as a whole if it's intentionally and patiently built with quality from the bottom, because it begins and ends with relationships. And so if you try and go too quickly, which is the tendency to want some kind of immaculate conception, you will create a very thin framework. And, you know, I know this world because a lot of institutions fund that stuff and they want a quick turn. And as a result, they don't get what they actually envisioned, which is a deep, broad bridging and bonding set of relationships. What they get is kind of thin gruel that isn't sustainable. If you're going to do it in the Fox Valley and it's going to be sustainable, like many of the organizations I had the good fortune of working with in different parts of the country are 30, 40, 50 years old. Grandkids are now the leaders of the organizations. But they took the time in the beginning to build a good foundation of relationships and slowly build that up over time. And you do events that keep reminding people of the vision of the promised land, but you do not try and take them across the wilderness in a week. Am I making sense at all? Because, Paul, I'm trying to just be straightforward with you on the patience it takes to build relationships and to build them deep and broad.
Yeah. And Tom, that raises the question: if you're in this group where you want to know, well, do we have some kind of function in terms of a belonging Fox City Valley, right? An idea that I think you might consider is how can we be precipitants of collective citizen action at the block level? Do we have a role in doing that kind of thing? And the word that we sort of chosen is precipitants, because a precipitant is if you have two entities, a precipitant brings the two entities together, but is not a part of what the two entities are once they've been brought together. So you're not involved in content, but what you are involved in is enabling people to contribute and to take on functions. So what are the precipitating kinds of activities that you might be worth, I think, a significant discussion in and of itself? Who are we if something is going to come from the bottom up? Do we have any function? And I think you do, and I think we have examples of people who've been good precipitators. And I think that's a very satisfying where you're not program pushing, you're not setting goals. What you are is the enablers of collective local citizen activity that increases their ability to perform functions, give their gifts, and as a result, feel that they belong together. So, for what it's worth, I think
I hope someone just recorded that or wrote that down.
I've got it recording. Thank you.
Recording. Yeah, I'm reminded in that conversation about, you know, again, what we did in Green Bay, and there's a lot we're still figuring out, and there's a lot that, you know, you guys have figured out that we haven't down in the valley. But the organizing work initially, I mean, there were 7 neighborhood associations, it seemed like, for a decade before there were 10, 15, and now, you know, 20 years in, there's 40 of them. but it was, it was an apparatus that provided some mini grants, some small competitive grant opportunities. It provided some small operating grant opportunities, and it had very low bar of like, okay, you're organized, you're having an annual meeting, you've got some sort of structure, some sort of governing docs, and you're doing some sort of communication piece to the rest of the neighborhood. And that was sufficient entry to sit at the table and then compete for some of these other resources. But there was no guidance in terms of what that had to be, or direction in terms of what that had to be. It was completely the local group coming up with it, and then it qualified because you jumped through the small hoops we created, and that was all that we needed. And they've just grown because each one kind of started inspiring its neighbors, and some staffing thrown at that over the years to say, okay, let's go and see if there's a couple of neighborhood watch groups in that neighborhood, or there's something going on in that neighborhood. Maybe we can help catalyze or precipitate, to use John's word, some folks to start making something happen. And there was always a willingness to have somebody attend a meeting and talk about how other folks do this or other things like that. But it was never done as a prescription. It was always done as just, here's some examples, you guys run it.
Okay, so I see us at having about 5 minutes left here, and so there are a few of you that we haven't heard from, and I love your people who I know have wonderful thoughts in your heads all the time. So I wanted to just kind of open it up for anyone who hasn't contributed something that you feel would be useful, and as well, Tom and John, kind of hearing sort of where we're at, if there's anything more that you feel like you want to recommend to us.
Julie, it would really be helpful, I know, to me and probably to John as well, if we could just hear from everybody, just what would be a takeaway from this that'll help you with what you want to do moving forward. So is there anything that, you took away?
Well, I want to, as far as that goes, Tom, I feel this concept is really significant in my head of this precipitating role, and how you juxtapose that with the bottom-up approach. I think I can kind of see that, but I think it has to be done with care so that you don't just take it over.
Amen.
But I would love to know, what are the most basic resources we would need to help nurture this bottom-up in neighborhoods? And specifically, is that hiring someone to go find a neighborhood connector, or what? Maybe Julia already knows these mechanics, but what's the most basic way? What resources would we need to start this?
Yeah, thanks. And when you say precipitate, I kept thinking what Noel said, which is prescribe, the difference between, right? That's a really wonderful takeaway. Precipitator versus a prescriber.
Mm-hmm.
What a wonderful metaphor.
Yeah,
thank you.
Exactly.
Yeah, Julie, I think that the kind of experience that they've had in Edmonton might be worth people here learning something about. It is an ultimately local initiative at the block level that is expanding to every block in the city. And it is done by precipitation. And one feature that they have developed, which I think is very interesting, is that their intention is to assure that there's a connector on every block, and they find people who are really already good connectors, and they hire them to find connectors, right? Maybe actually a lot, maybe 50 blocks. and then to nurture those connectors. And that's worked pretty well. Once again, there's no content focus. The connector is somebody who is offering the invitation for contribution and connection and the formation out of that sometimes of more formal kinds of association. But when it started on its own in a couple of blocks, and after a while it spread block by people who saw what was happening. And the interesting thing is that the city began to see that what was happening at the block level was people were beginning to fulfill functions that the city had always tried to get them to do, right? And so they have created and hired a couple of the key people to be in charge of neighborhood precipitation. I'm not sure that's the world's greatest idea because I'm always a little leery of that much control at the top. But at any rate, for those who feel, how does this go from a block to a city? You can see it alive and well in Edmonton, Canada. And we've done a lot to support their story being told, and Julie knows it well. And maybe there's a way that you can have them join you for an effort to describe how they went about doing what they're doing.
Yeah, we can certainly do that.
Good.
Hi, I'm just going to make a comment. I have to jump off on it to another 2 o'clock meeting, but I just wanted to say a lot of what was said today I felt was affirming. And as someone who sees herself as a bridge to the role that philanthropy can play, a thought that's been swirling in my mind from a colleague in Seattle that I think was also reinforced on this call was the roles that we can play we all interact with systems, right? Or we all represent institutions and systems. And that we have to, instead of trying to prepare the community to interact with that system, we have to prepare the system to be in right relationship with the community. And so that's the role that I see myself playing in helping to get philanthropy to think differently about how it engages in this work. So that's the role that I see myself as a regional, recognizing that neighborhood is important, and like several folks said, it's one approach, right, that needs to be supported, but that we need to be open to responding to how those communities want to form, whether that's inside a neighborhood or outside. We have to be open to what that looks like.
Thanks for that, Lynn. Stephanie, do you have any thoughts? I'm gonna pick on you.
Yeah. So a lot of this is, I work at the health department. I don't think I got to introduce myself in the very beginning. And right now we're doing a lot of work around just looking at some of the data we have. So it's a role that we can play to help measure things around social connectedness. But the whole idea of social connectedness for us emerged by just going out and listening to our community. And things around belongingness and wanting to be able to talk together and work together face to face is what our community had shared back to us when we asked the basic question of how else can your health be improved. So they connected their sense of relationship to one another to their own health. So that's fantastic. It was a huge open-ended question. We never expected to hear that kind of a response from them. But when we went to listen to our community some more, focused more on the relationship piece, what you had said, John, is really bullet point what we heard back. One, people want a strength of relationship. Two, they want to feel valued as who they are and what they are in their community. And three, they want to offer a meaningful contribution. So that could be anything from walking the neighborhood kids to school to leading their neighborhood association. But it's those three pieces that we have had heard over and over again. So if you want some kind of parameters or a sense of like huge vision, like those three things is what we keep landing on, whether you use the word connectedness or belongingness or ending isolation. Those three pieces just keep coming back, and I don't know what the magical like words and stuff are that we need to use. But this idea of strength of relationship, the feeling valued for who you are, and then being able to offer back something that you feel is meaningful to the people around you. That's the simpleness of it's simple and it's complicated, right? But that's where we kept landing.
Julie, I'm going to have to leave for another meeting, but it's been wonderful to be with everybody. Sorry.
No,
Thanks, John.
thanks, John. We're really at the end of our time. So, so I don't know, Tom, if you have any last bit, I don't feel like we should keep anyone on much longer here because we were just going to go for an hour. Stephanie, that's really, I'm glad you brought that in and shared that with them because I think that is really so important what you learned. Tom, do you have anything else for us?
Yeah, the only thing I have is I just think the conversation is going in the right direction of trying to figure out how institutions, and I just thought it was so well said about preparing the institutions to be in right relationship. That is so powerful and a wonderful way of phrasing that. And that is no small task given the power of institutions today. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to be part of this conversation, and I hope we continue.
Thank you. I do too. Okay, thank you all. I have this recorded. I'm really glad I did because this was just an excellent conversation. I'm so grateful for it. And we will, all those of us who can, we will be talking now tomorrow morning with Deborah Puntenny, and we're going to talk to her about sort of the outcomes of social connectedness in a neighborhood, on the neighborhood scale. And she's been involved in a long-term project around health outcomes in neighborhoods that I think will be helpful to us following today. And I apologize for all this, a large amount of time that we're investing, but I think it'll be great to have these things so close together.
Thanks, Julie.
Okay, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye.
Take care.